Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. We're joined by Karen Walsh here today. Karen, thank you for coming. Karen is somewhat of an expert when it comes to compliance, specifically CMMC. I'll leave it over to you to introduce yourself, Karen.
Okay, well, my name is Karen, obviously. I am a non-practicing attorney who taught first-year college writing, is a registered practitioner with under CMMC, and wanted to be a lobbyist and decided that that looked like it was going to be really hard. So now I just talk about compliance and write about it a lot.
So what's really more important is, I like to think of myself as a really good security guy, but and I kind of can scrape by some of these compliance documentations. Karen knows shitloads about this stuff, and so hopefully, if you have questions, now is the time to ask them, or throughout the webinar. We're going to walk through some of the basics, what CMMC means, how is it important, why is it important, how is it relevant to you, how you can use it to make money, how you can tie some of those controls to your existing security controls or potentially new security controls. But we're really here just to answer your questions and hopefully make you understand CMMC better off. We actually have a document that Karen very kindly helped us draft. So I'm going to pull that up and I'm going to share that on my screen, and we can use that as our we're not going to read through it, absolutely not, but it gives us topic points to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen just so you've got it. And I'll use the words Karen helped us produce, because if there's any mistakes, it's probably not Karen's.
I make a lot of mistakes in my life, so
So maybe we can start off talking about what is CMMC. I mean, a lot of people have heard about it. A lot of people have got clients asking about it, but maybe we can break it down at a very high level. What does it mean?
Sure. So CMMC is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. The DoD worked with a whole bunch of industry professionals and organizations so that they could create this maturity model. What's interesting about this is that while there are a lot of ways to do it prescriptively, as a maturity model, it gives you steps to walk through to help you figure out where you are now and how you need to get to where you need to be. I feel that it's very much a do or do not, there is no try sort of approach, in that it's not based on risk like most other frameworks. It's really based on whether you're controlling FCI, which is federal contract information, or CUI, which is controlled unclassified information. So if you are only FCI, that is level 1, you just have to show that you're doing best practices. It's a fairly easy bar. If you are managing controlled unclassified information, CUI, it's a much higher bar. So that would be CMMC level 3 maturity. And CMMC level 2 is sort of like giving you extra credit for going beyond level 1, but not getting to level 3 yet. And still you can only apply for contracts that manage FCI. So at the end of the day, the real benefit to an MSP and an MSSP's customer is whether they will be able to still engage in the bid process for a DoD contract. And for MSPs and MSSPs that also work with the DoD, you're going to need to actually meet that compliance standard as well.
So CMMC is essentially a set of rules, but it's and there's minimum standards. So with FCI, you have a lower standard of controls and a lower standard of requirements. Those standards are pulled from NIST specifically, or is there different options for that?
So the short story is CMMC is CMMC. The longer story is that it maps across NIST, CIS benchmarks, a couple of other things, in order to get the technical controls in place. Now, level 1 is super easy because all you have to do is basically talk to an auditor, show them that you are doing the things you say you're doing, and you don't have to have a lot of documentation. You don't have to have processes written down. When you get to level 3, it becomes a lot more strenuous. So you need to have documentation in place. You need to have an audit trail. You need to be having appropriate practices written down and appropriate processes written down. And CMMC also breaks things out into sort of practices and requirements. So you have a set of practices that map to, and I should double check this real quick, a set of practices that map to the different other things you need to do. That didn't come out well. That map to the domain. So you have domains, things like access control, which I think is a great, segue for Threat Locker at some point towards the end of this a little bit, but access controls is a huge one for them. You have things like configuration management. There's a whole bunch of different practices hidden within the different levels.
So now you mentioned auditors. Who are the auditors for CMMC? For those who don't know it.
So at the moment, they don't have the full set of auditors yet. They're running a little behind. I think it was only in the last week or two that they first gave credence to the first set of certified practitioners. So there's 2 different groups of professionals under CMMC. There's registered practitioners like me who can sort of advise on things. And then there's certified C3PAOs, certified third-party audit organizations and auditors. So if you are a C3PAO, you are the one actually going in and doing the checklists, making sure everything is the way it is, reviewing the documentation. If you are an RPO or an RP, you can advise on it, but you're not allowed to do the actual audits.
And typically, are they to get certified as an auditor? Are they? I mean, if you look at like SOC 2 as a compliance, they're CPAs. CPAs audit SOC 2, which I always find amusing, but it is what it is. But who are typical auditors? Are they IT professionals? Are they security professionals? Or is it just a range across the board of people who have gone through the certification?
That's a good question. I don't have 100% of the answer. I do know that I've seen a lot of security auditing companies doing it, but they haven't really released it yet. They literally rolled out the first round of approved C3PAOs in the last, I want to say 2 weeks, because I saw it somewhere. So you can go to I'll even pop it in the chat here for everybody. You can go to cmmcab.org website, where they have a lot more information about how to get registered as one and the training you can go through. I found most of it was because I write about CMMC a lot, and I've read CMMC 17 bajillion times at this point. I felt that a lot of it was stuff I sort of already knew, but
I like to,
lower. Yes, go ahead, Danny.
I'd like to move on to some of the challenges and the opportunities that MSPs have from this. And somebody just asked the question, will the slides be sent? I'd like to say slides. You can actually download this white paper from our website. I'm 99.9% sure. If it's not, we'll email it out. But I think if you go on our website and you go to resources, you can download this white paper here, the CMMC white paper. If it's not there, we'll make sure it's there afterwards. But there's obviously a lot of challenges for MSPs in that quite often MSPs are the IT guy. They're the person who's responsible for fixing computers. And I always say the difference between an IT guy and a security guy is people like IT people, they don't like security people. So if you want friends, you don't want to be a security guy. if you don't want friends, are you quite happy being like me and miserable and in the corner by yourself eating your lunch? You can be the security guy.
Or the auditor. Nobody likes the auditor either. It's really bad for your self-esteem.
No, if you want to be hated, you can be an auditor.
Oh, fair enough. Fair enough.
You're going even further low down the standards. Then the auditor is the person that is really hated, because the IT security guy is at least trying to do something productive for the business. The auditor is trying to trip you up and find reasons to fail you. I'm sure there's some nice auditors as well.
I was a very nice auditor. My clients loved me.
So It's like when you get the inspection on your electrics on your house and they fine you because you forgot to put a label on an outlet. so those kind of things. There's two things for MSPs here. One is there's a huge opportunity in that getting CMMC compliant outside of the logistics of the auditing and the preparation and the documentation requires product in many cases, or at very least requires services, because it requires you to have endpoint detection. It requires you to have things like access controls and application whitelisting and privileged access management and those kind of solutions in place. So there's a huge opportunity for MSPs here, but it's also a challenge because customers want it now, and sometimes these products, these solutions, these changes aren't that easy to make. But there's also opportunity, I imagine, from MSPs to help the client check the boxes that they don't know about. So getting the client, I mean, if they're not an auditor, they're not going to be able to audit them, but bringing them to a level where an auditor can come in, or at least a pre-auditor can come in and say, okay, now we just need to align these tiny parts. Because most small businesses, if an auditor came in today, is just going to laugh and say, you know, I can't even start.
I can't even, right, yeah.
Yeah.
I can't even. You know, that's an excellent point. And I think it's one of the things, I think it's a huge opportunity for MSPs. Mainly because this will be a requirement for companies that want to have those contracts. You don't want to lose that contract if you're the company. So getting compliant is going to be something that is mission critical. So some of the things that MSPs can do is to sort of help their clients understand where they are. You're not an RP. You may want to get an RP involved. You may want to partner with an RP, but there are certain basic things you need to help your clients and customers understand. So one of the ones that I think is super interesting, and I'm just double checking something here. I believe, excuse me, that yes, in other words, access controls actually make up 27% of the level 1 and 20% of the level 3 CMMC practices. So if you look at CMMC, a good 30 to 20 to 30% is based around access controls and making sure that you're limiting user access, you're limiting application to application access, that your customers understand who is getting access to what and minimizing it. So from that perspective, I definitely think MSPs have the ability to sort of educate their customer base. In terms of leveraging your services, it kind of depends on what you're doing. Like, you need to understand as well what your requirements are if this somehow puts you into the DoD pipeline and supply chain.
I think there's another point of CMMC as well, in that it's essentially a legal requirement to achieve certain standards. But the reason for that legal requirement is not to be a pain in the ass, which I know the federal government likes to be, but is to try and stop cyber breaches. So as an MSP who can follow the requirements of CMMC from an IT perspective, from a security perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, this isn't just something that you can pitch to your federal clients. It's something that you can pitch to your non-federal clients, to local businesses, and say, these are the things we're doing. You don't need to get an audit. Great, you saved a bunch of money, but we're going to do this for you. We're going to make sure that these check boxes are checked. And we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. And these are the controls that are being recommended for these reasons. And frankly, if the federal government's recommending something or requiring it, then you know it's an absolute minimum.
Right, especially because this is part of the DoD pipeline. I will say that I've talked about it on Twitter and with some other friends in the community. I really think that whether or not it's a federal client or not, the executive order that came out last month is definitely hinting at leveraging CMMC throughout the federal, including the civilian agencies and their supply chains. There's going to be a lot of discussion around things like cloud security, and a lot of the best practices that are in CMMC do map to other requirements. So whether it's a SOC or whether it's a SOX or whether it's HIPAA even, they're going to see a lot of overlaps because it does go back and it does trace across NIST. So any security or privacy initiative that maps back to NIST 853, 800, 171. What's the other one I want to talk about? 800.
853, 171.
I want to say like 280 or something. The one that's like the very fine technical controls. It maps all the way back to those because it's really building on those. So what I like about it is that it does give very specific requirements once you dig in and cross map things.
Maybe this is a good time to talk about the executive order. I was doing an interview for CNN and they asked me to talk about I think it was CNN. They asked me to talk about the order. And so I kind of digested it in 45 minutes as fast as I could because it literally just been posted that day. So I was like, well, what does this mean? What does it? And when I first started reading it, my blood actually started boiling at the beginning because I started hearing this word zero trust. And zero trust is a bit of a marketing buzzword, but they actually then very clearly defined.
Yes.
The first time I've ever seen it defined, in what does it actually mean? Because I hear it used a lot and we use it ourselves. I mean, how we perceive it is least privilege, it's denied by default. And it's pretty much exactly how they defined it, that something is only given access to when it's needed and only for the people that it's needed, whether it's a permission to a file or a application or various other things. But maybe give us your thoughts on this executive order. What does it mean and how I mean, right now it's pretty much focused around federal government agencies, those in the supply chain of federal government agencies. But do you see it being used more frequently or?
So my take on this is if you really, I come from a law background. I did a lot of admin law in law school. It was sort of my go-to. It was a really easy standard to remember because it's arbitrary and capricious. So whatever an agency says, an agency gets. And one of the things that really hit me when looking at the executive order and reading through it is that the only agency specifically discussed is the Department of Defense. And they specifically reference the DFARS and they specifically reference FAR. And they specifically discuss how the DoD needs to reassess its contract language. Now, all of that is going to directly relate to CMMC because CMMC is going forward, going to be in every DoD contract. I think by 2025 is sort of their final date, but whether that happens or not is clearly something to be discussed elsewhere and probably not here. So that's the only one that they bring up. They also are talking about having the FCEB agency, so the Federal Civilian something agencies. How do I put this? Give them list out all of what they think should be considered sensitive data. In other words, these agencies are going to be cataloging what they consider to be sensitive data, which ultimately makes a really excellent map back to controlled, unclassified information. Because it may be stuff that doesn't need to be highly classified, but it may be things that need to be taken better care of or protected better or secured better. Well, so I do think we're going to see sort of an explosion of that. And then if that becomes, again, like I keep saying, sort of the one reg to rule them all, or you're going to end up seeing everybody in that supply chain doing it. And if you're in that supply chain, it starts to expand and it starts to spread and it starts to become a bit more of a standardized approach to something.
So a couple of questions I just want to get answered in the chat. Somebody, and I think they've kind of answered their own question. It's my understanding that as an MSP, we can assist our clients in helping their infrastructure be aligned with CMMC or NIST controls, but we cannot do the actual assessment or audit as we have to remain impartial. My thought is the assessment, check, yes, audit, not check.
Right.
So in that you can assess your client and you can give them an informal assessment, but not an official audit. But I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, Aaron, I see it. So I agree with Danny. I think there's sort of this fine line to walk just to be on the safe side. Again, lawyer, I always try to limit my risk as much as possible in telling them what you think best practices are and how you can help them meet those best practices. Pretty much anybody can help guide a customer through the processes and practices. You cannot do an audit unless you are a certified third-party assessor organization or certified third-party assessor. And if you are one, you can't also do the other. So if you have a registered professional, that person can't be involved in anything that has to do with the audit and vice versa. So there's definitely sort of a wall between the two, and you want to make sure that you're just keeping it that way and choosing which direction you and your org want to go in.
Another question we have is, I'm just looking through, there's quite a few questions coming in here. So if I'm not answering them all, I apologize.
So do CMMC tools create a compliance issue? I'm not, if you want to just kind of ask a little bit further, I can get to that. I can't answer it specifically. I think, again, it goes back to making sure that your stuff is as secure as possible. So whatever you are doing, you want to make sure that you meet the same sort of level of requirements, because your clients are going to be asking you and double checking your security controls. Do you fall within the supply chain? That's probably a level, I'm not going to say what level it would be a level 1 or a level 3, but it depends on if you're actually managing the data. So if you store data, then you have to know what type of data you're storing.
Somebody's asked the question as well, and I think this is probably a question more for me. Will CMMC, will ThreatLocker be a CMMC compliant cloud vendor that we can use for some of our customers? I think I'm not actually familiar what CMMC compliant cloud vendor is, but ThreatLocker is fully DFARS compliant now. We do have an option. There's some ITAR stuff. DFARS isn't required in this option. There's some ITAR stuff that requires us to not allow certain accounts to be managed by non-US citizens. So if we have certain customer accounts, you can flag them. It's not specific to DFARS, and I don't think if you've got DoD data, I don't even think it's specific to that, because I think the data you're sending to ThreatLocker is not going to be in any of those classifications. But we do follow DFARS now. I didn't know there was such thing as a cloud vendor, so that's probably a question to go away and look at. We also, from a audit point of view, we also do a SOC 2 Type 2 if anyone's interested in or requires that, because normally large vendors require that to show what controls you have in place. I think I'm not sure if there's two parts to that. The second part is then, provided this is possible, will you be able to help us determine which controls and practices your product will satisfy? Yeah, so part of this document actually aligns our product to a lot of the controls. So you can download this at the end, and the link's been put in there, and it shows you which ones we align our checkboxes to. Whether it's CMMC or SOC 2 or HIPAA or any other requirement you have, there are two types of checkboxes I like to call in our product, and every product is going to do this. There's black and white checkboxes: application whitelisting, blocking unauthorized software, whatever you want to call it. That's a black and white checkbox that we probably not only do, but we're the best vendor out there to do that. The controlling application access to things, auditing file access, blocking down storage devices. These are things that ThreatLocker does, and we're going to go through some of those. But then there's also some gray checkboxes. If you've got very small clients that need to check boxes like audit logons to systems, I would not say that's what ThreatLocker does, but you cannot audit access your system without it logging in ThreatLocker. So I've seen audits pass as a result of that. It's not a logon auditing thing, but it does indirectly audit logon. So there's some other gray areas, whereas if you've got small clients who can't go off and buy a logon auditing tool, but you have a unified audit and you capture that data, you can show the auditor, yes, this is how I can see a report of who's logging into a systems. We can see who ran when log on, who accessed the systems, and everything else there as well. So I'm just going down. I think you answered that one. Do CMMC tools create compliance? Did you answer that one? Do CMMC tools?
Yeah, I did. I skipped over the other one.
Uh,
What rules must you follow to work with a client? So I think the rules that I would suggest are pretty much what you would do normally. You know, you want to suggest best practices. You want to understand the different control levels. You want to be able to tell them, you know, these are the family of control. These are the families of controls that you need to use. Excuse me. And these are the controls that we generally suggest. You want to make sure that you can tell them whether or not what your service provides answers to those. So a good example would be, and especially I loved this when I was looking at Threat Locker. It's one of the things that made me go, "Whoo, that's awesome." CMMC under configuration management requires that you restrict, disable, or prevent the use of non-essential programs, functions, ports, protocols, and services. And something that you can say is, you know, with Threat Locker, we can help you lock down your controls better. We can make sure that, you know, you have better application to application connectivity and all of those things. So I think you need to consider when you're talking to your customers about the family of controls and where they need to be. I hope that answered that question for people.
the other thing I wanted to actually touch back on was somebody mentioned the NIST cybersecurity framework is a good place to start, and I don't know if you're very familiar with this, the cybersecurity framework. To me, it seems like a relatively simple understanding of the other NIST controls. Have you worked much on that, Karen? Or
I've worked with NIST CSF. I agree that I think it's a good place to start, but in a lot of respects, CMMC is extremely different. Like I said earlier, it is very prescriptive in who has to meet the different levels. So unlike the risk framework and the RMF and the CSF, a lot of it there is risk driven. CMMC, you know, pretty much says, I don't care. It is very much, you know, you have that, it's very much like you have X information, you need to meet X requirement. So in that respect, it doesn't necessarily work. It's good if you're looking at the controls, but even buried within CMMC, they do list out the controls. As a matter of fact, I will pop into the chat a really great thing from the CMMC website. If Danny wants to take a quick second there for me.
I will pull that up if it
Or
can.
not.
Did it drop?
So if you go into the CMMC website,
Did you drop that in the chat? Did you, Karen?
I am about to. I'm about to. They do a really great job of giving everybody the level 1, and I'm popping it in chat right now. The level 1, and that's the first one, and the level 3 assessment guides. And what you'll see in there is where they link back to all of the different NIST requirements. So I actually think this is a really great way to just kind of say, okay, what are the requirements? I'm pretty sure it clearly lists like the mapping. Although I've read all of them so many times at this point, I could be imagining things, which would not be beyond me at this point.
It's, well, you read so many documents and you start, well, you fill in the pieces yourself.
Right.
I did want to bring up a point, because you mentioned something a little bit back around the non-classified data, and a lot of the cyber breaches that are impactful aren't, I mean, obviously we think about ransomware all the time.
Right.
It's what hurts most businesses, and we think about backups and we think about what we can do. And obviously when we think about the Colonial pipeline being shut down, which what triggered the executive order to come out from the White House. Most of the impact of that wasn't about classified data. I mean, I can't, and CMMC really had no relevance there. What it was mostly about, not even about data, but about systems that need to be accessible. And quite often those systems, as a company with 100 computers, if all of our computers went offline today, not for ransomware, let's just say we pushed a Windows update, and because Windows update would never push a bad update, and all of our all of our computers went down, and we had to rebuild them all from scratch. That's painful. I mean, that's pretty painful. But we would make it. It wouldn't cause us any massive business detriment because we've got a lot of techs to do it as well. But if you're a pipeline and you've got 2,000, 5,000, 6,000, 10,000 machines, and you've got 3 IT people because you're massively under-resourced, and now you've got all of these machines that are offline, that isn't even about data. It's about operational systems. And in these cases, CMMC requirements will protect those. And they're saying, and tell me if I'm wrong, please, if you have classified data, you have to protect your systems with this, this, and this, so you indirectly.
So I am going to just kind of touch base on that for a second, because it's important to make the distinction here between controlled unclassified data and classified data. Controlled unclassified data has this like very broadish kind of definition that ultimately also notes is covered by any other regulation and security or privacy regulation. So generally it's going to talk about, what you're saying, system security and system uptime, but it's also very specific to, it's not classified data, it's controlled unclassified data, because classified data has a whole other level. And my guess is that will end up being the level 4s and the level 5s as they move through the process. I want to answer a quick question that I saw in the chats here. The DoD isn't giving out the certifications yet. So at this point, they are starting with the highest, most important prime contractors. So unless you're a prime contractor with the DoD, that's not in the contract yet. They're rolling it out. I think they keep calling it the crawl, walk, run approach. And internally in your MSP, again, that is going to be dependent on what data you manage. So if all you have is what's defined as federal contract language, you're probably fine at level 1. If you have the controlled unclassified information, then it's also going to be the level 3.
I think some of this MSP internally, and this is where we have to decide, do we manage the data or do we have access to the data? So MSPs are in this incredibly unique position in that they run these wonderful things called RMM tools. And RMM tools make them gods, essentially. And if they get sick, everyone gets sick because they essentially have access to all of their client systems. So if you do not directly but indirectly have access, so if you have access to someone's computer to support them and they have access to classified or controlled data under CMMC, do you, in your opinion,
Yes.
and I don't think we're going to get a direct answer to this. We'll see it in the Supreme Court in 5 years' time, maybe.
Probably, yeah.
But in your opinion, does the MSP have to, and it sounds like there's very little room for audits at the moment, but do they need to be CMMC level 3 if the client has to be CMMC level 3?
Right. The answer that I am going to run with is, and I'm also going to sort of explain something to the MSPs because I think it's going to help you working with your customers as well. The direct answer is, if you are not physically managing the data and it's not part of your contract, then you are not required to be certified. I am, however, going to make 2 slight caveats. One, and people are going to hate this because this is one of those things where lawyers come in. I'm a little concerned that they're going to use CMMC sort of as, to take it where no compliance requirement has gone before. One thing that concerned me as a former auditor was listening to them talk about the Christian doctrine, which not a lot of people know about. Basically, what that does is undermine generalized contract law, and basically says it's specific to federal contracts, but it does say, if you knew that this was supposed to be a requirement, then you're held liable, even if it's not in your contract. So I think there's going to be, as Danny said, probably some difficult conversations down the road, but it's also something for you to point out to your clients. They are definitely in the trainings discussing this doctrine. I've written about it. And they talked about it enough during their like legal session of the registered professional training that it pinged me. So I do think that it's important to say to your clients, not only what are you doing now, but what is your future plan? Are you planning to expand your offerings that may actually involve this down the road? Now is the time to get started. Or, if you end up creating what turns out to be CUI, how do you manage that? So I think there's definitely part of this, feeling that they're gonna be pushing it hard. How hard, I'm not sure. And again, if you are an MSP, it is based on what you control.
So,
If that data is in your control, that's what you have to deal with, not what's in your customer's control.
so I think there's a difference as well. So CMMC
Right.
is a law that
It's
essentially
not a law. It's not a law. Sorry, it's a standard.
it's a
The standard
standard. It's but if
within
you
your contracts. Yes.
in order to obtain contracts, you have to have that standard dealt with. But outside of CMMC, you still have negligence, and you're still ultimately responsible. If you are breached and your client's breached, your client has, as a result of that, your client has the right to bring a lawsuit against you. I mean, anyone has a right to bring a lawsuit against anyone, but has a possibility of achieving success in a lawsuit where they come and say, my system was hacked because my MSP didn't follow. And I think back down to this, what controls must I have? At the end of the day, you must have every control that is required to secure your environment. And if you don't have enough controls, you're leaving your business vulnerable. Now, there is no such thing as 100% secure, but what you need to do is be comfortable that you cannot get breached. Now, if you are going below standards, then, and Karen, then I imagine you can answer this with your legal background. Then you start talking about, is the punitive
Right.
damage as a result of that, because you did something, you decided, I don't want to put a firewall in because it cost me too much money. And now my client has been breached as a result of that. And then I imagine from a legal hole that a lawyer you're going to get really
Yeah.
deep into that.
That's a good question. I do want to say that if you are following along in the chat, there's been a good discussion about processing stuff and what need and where there's more information about that. And I do think that for MSPs and MSSPs, there's also that additional layer of, how responsible are we down the road? And it's going to boil down to, what did you say in your contract you were going to do? A lot of contracts I know generally contain things about who's responsible and where the negligence lies. In this case, if something happens and your customer has a problem, is there going to be flow down to you? So that would be my answer.
Couple of things. I know there's some FedRAMP stuff in there. Outside of CMMC, ThreatLocker is currently pursuing FedRAMP compliance. I don't think it's not a requirement for ThreatLocker, and I think some of our clients and partners have already answered that for me. But it's something that we're actually pursuing, because as everything in the world, not being a requirement and making it easier to sell to certain contracts is a whole different story. So we are currently pursuing FedRAMP compliance. It's not FedRAMP and CMMC are two different things as well. And you might be able to break it into that, but that's something we're currently going through as a process, and it's not a nice process. I think it's worse than CMMC, but you might.
I think it's extremely painful. I've worked at companies and with clients who've done it, and it's extremely painful. So yeah, I'd also like to say yes. The amen for much needed tort law reform is right up there with you. Let me see if there are any questions. I'm not seeing any. I see one. Should not key infrastructure be isolated? I mean, that's an excellent question. Again, I think it very much goes back to, what information you're managing and where you're managing it. I think a lot of small businesses are going to need a lot of help, because I think depending on what they want to do and whether they want to scale, it's going to be difficult. I don't think any of this is going to be easy. I think getting the documentation is going to be tough. I do know, and since I am on ThreatLocker's webinar here, when I took a look at their audit capabilities, I loved it. Again, as an internal auditor, so I definitely think having that trail for them is going to be something that's also something you can sort of say, look, you don't need to make the audit trail yourself. Here's what we provide you with your audit trail to show you those controls.
On the mention of isolation, we should always be isolating to the most amount possible. But people often think of like, okay, well, closed circuit as opposed to open circuit back in the camera days. The reality is, I turn on my faucet, water comes out, that goes through my water meter. My water meter sends electronic signals to the water company. All of this has to merge together. And isolated to what point? It could be just on the water company's network, but that gets very difficult for a water company to transmit data without using internet infrastructure.
Right.
So that they start talking about, obviously everything should be isolated to the most amount reasonably possible. But in today's world, we can't just say IoT is off this network, key infrastructure is off this network, because even if you take it off it, and this is where IoT and IT merge, and we talk about key infrastructure, at the end of the day, people are doing jobs, and people need computers to do their jobs. And even if they are literally taking a reading from a computer and piping it into a separate system, they still need that computer there. We're not in a world where someone runs down with a carbon copy paper order anymore. So it's very, very difficult to completely isolate, but it should be separated where possible. I kind of brought this access controls part because as we get through this document, and I know we will end up running out of time very quickly, maybe you want to talk very high level to this access control requirements, Karen.
Sure. Let me just go back and double check here. I'm much better if I'm looking at something than if I'm talking off the top of my head, as I think a lot of people in the chat have noticed. So access controls is a huge one. What's interesting to me is where a lot of the access controls and configuration management controls are starting to overlap. So, you've got least privilege, principle of least privilege, the least amount of access someone should have just to do their job. And let's see. So we've got things like documenting your procedures is going to be huge. And the documentation process for a lot of companies is going to be burdensome and overwhelming. So anything that you can do to help your customers document their procedures for protecting CUI within the organization will be gigantic for them. It'll be more than a +1. It'll be like a +100, I think, especially like I said, for those smaller ones. Let me see.
So I think from the ThreatLocker point of view, obviously my background is in corporate security, and I love controls. I kind of shy away from using antivirus as a security method. It's more of a I screwed up method in my mind. I love controls, and I love the idea of least privilege, and we strive in ThreatLocker to continuously do least privilege. And there's areas where obviously giving the user the least amount of access to data, but giving the users the least amount of access to applications. And there's a reason for this. People often think, well, if it's a good application, why do I care? Why do I care if a user downloads a game on their computer? Well, how does that affect my security? Well, I'll tell you how it affects your security in lots of ways. One is by having an open standard, they can download a bad application and you're going to miss the bad. But also every time you're running something, if you're running an executable, a program, that program has access to all of the data that the user has access to. We saw what happened with SolarWinds. We saw Internet Explorer vulnerabilities. We saw Zoom vulnerabilities. And these aren't saying you shouldn't run these programs. They're saying every program you run, you increase your surface area of attack, you increase your ability to have a backdoor, and those programs can access all of your data. So the first thing is limiting the amount of data a user can access. But if they need to access it, Also limiting what programs they run. So if you do have a rogue program, it can't access something that it doesn't need to. The next thing is limiting what the programs can access. And this is where I stress with the ring fencing over and over again, is don't let a program access more than it can. And we're actually adding maturity levels into Threat Locker as well, because just like CMMC, Threat Locker can be as complicated or as simple as you want it to be. We want to get you as mature as possible. But does this program need to access my network shares? Does this need to access my financial data? If it doesn't, take it away. And the same applies to those Chrome extensions. People think they're harmless. Guess what? Chrome extensions can see everything on the page. Tell your customers this, educate them, because they do not think, wait there, by me installing this web extension, it can read my passwords. That's not to say it will, and that's not to say they shouldn't install it, but least privilege to do their job means you take away, I mean, literally we see you can reduce your Chrome extensions by 90+%. You can reduce your applications. You take away all your risk of malware and ransomware, or most of your risk, by doing that.
And I think another good point that I want to make sure that we don't lose it is that if you go down to, and Danny, if you'd like to just kind of scroll down to system, keep going, system and communications protections, because even at level 1, that's, is it under maintenance? Yeah, just type in find. It might be easier because that's a long document. But even at level 1, a basic security hygiene practice is boundary protection and making sure that applications can only access what they need to, and setting up, one of the things that they talked about in the registered practitioner training when I was looking at it again last week is even putting notifications on certain workstations because they contain unclassified information. Controlled unclassified information. So if you've got a workstation and you've got applications on that workstation, you want to make sure that workstation never gets to the public internet, because that's losing that control, or it adds at least an extra layer of control. So a lot of the system and communications protections, denying by default and allowing by exception, performing regular scans to trusted network boundaries, making sure that there's no unauthorized connections that can be accessible across the boundary. All of these best practices are going to be necessary, I think, in a lot of ways, for even just if you have like one workstation that only one person can access, it's still going to have some of those controls on it to make sure it doesn't become, an access point.
I want to give you an example of how this works in the real world as well, and not specific to Threat Locker, but think about the SolarWinds breach. Think about how that worked. There was a piece of software that had a backdoor. Inevitably, if you were using SolarWinds, you'd made a decision. This is a business decision to use SolarWinds, and that's not to go and say buy another product, because guess what? Every single the next vendor is going to have equal number of breaches too. But you made that decision, and that decision hit you in the face. I can tell you where it's saved customers, both with and without Threat Locker. With Threat Locker, where they had SolarWinds ring fenced to only be able to talk out to SolarWinds, that backdoor wasn't able to download the malicious code. A lot of vulnerabilities involve downloading malicious code, because quite often they're not big enough for someone to inject what they want. So it wasn't able to go off and, I correct myself, it had malicious code. It wasn't able to download the instruction. So it had a feature to go off and download something. So if you were ring fencing it and saying it could only go to SolarWinds, it couldn't do that. But equally, if you set your firewall to only allow your SolarWinds server to go to SolarWinds, it would have stopped it too. Right. So those kind of least privileges, they're going to block a lot more than you think. And there's always going to be vulnerabilities in software. The question is, how effective is it going to be when it's exploited? So limiting what it can do and where it can talk to, the network controls, the file access, you just take away you reduce the risk so much it becomes, okay, I got stung, but I didn't really get stung because they couldn't do anything. And we saw that a lot with people who were ring fenced. I also saw, big enterprise clients that had those servers that weren't able to go out to the internet regardless, and that solved that problem too. They're very effective at stopping those breaches. So they're not just here for some guy and some politician who decided to write this. They're actually effective controls that do things.
worked hard on CMMC, and when you look at, as much as it's going to be a pain for everybody, and as much as a lot of people are going to say, this is highly illogical or whatever, there is a lot in it that I think has value. I think where maybe some people are going to be struggling is the documentation is just going to be super hard. So you can't just say, I have these controls. You have to have processes in place. And that's where people are going to struggle. I think that's where the MSPs and MSSPs come in and say, look, we can help you because we know you need the help and it's too much for your organization.
I think part of the frustration here is, I don't know if you've got any comment on that, is quite often when you go into these documents, you see how long they are. And we went through the same procedure. We did SOC 2 Type 2, and we had a password policy before that. And it basically was 3 lines and said, have a strong password, no, special characters long, no words, no names, no dogs. It was a couple of lines and said, don't be a dumbass, basically. And when we went through our SOC 2, our password policy had to be adjusted, written by a lawyer, as opposed to, and now our password policy is 2 pages long, and there's a lot of frustration to that. I think when you get into CMMC or any kind of compliance, is why is this so many words? And maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Honestly, and the more I do alignments and cross mapping, when you go back to the fundamental underlying documents, it doesn't even matter what country you're in, because GDPR has a lot of weird language too. But when you go to those technical controls, especially 853, they're law. You read, it's not just like the control will be like, put a password in place, A, make it, hard to discover, B, do something else. And then there's a page of description of the control or discussion around the control. And that becomes really difficult because there's a lot embedded in those that need to, for compliance reasons or for legal reasons, go into the policies. So I think that's another gigantic benefit that MSPs and MSSPs can bring their clients is, we know what the policies need to say. We have the controls and we can show you how the controls work, and we can take that burden off of you. And, then you can say, then they can say, here's the policy. And yeah, it's because lawyers like a lot of words, which is why I'm not practicing.
Yeah. So, well, and there's the reason, I guess, but I think simplifying these yourself allows you to reuse them across your clients too, and be able to go in and say, this checkbox, this checkbox, this checkbox. We do have a question around just threat locker support logging to SIM. Yes, we have various native integrations. If you're already a partner, just ask the cyber heroes, ask your sales engineer, say, this is my requirement, I need to get into Splunk, and we'll help you get into Splunk, and we'll help you get the data you need to into Splunk. And obviously you can also access it from our UI itself. I know we've got a limited amount of time, and I appreciate you spending time with us today. Is there something you want to say that's really important, Karen, that you think everyone should be thinking about as they're going down the CMMC path or any kind of compliance path?
I think that the most important thing to do is really understand what you need to do and what your customers need to have done. Because from a compliance standpoint, I'm a huge fan of security first. Like if you secure it and you've got all the right controls in place, the documentation can follow a lot more easily. So explaining how you can help control, how you can help secure the data and how you can help give them a more effective and efficient security posture ultimately will map back to CMMC, HIPAA, everything else. A lot of it tends to be the devil is in those details. And as long as you know which details there are, you should be okay. I mean, there's a finite number of controls out there when you stop and think about it. And, all of them talk about it. It's just which ones they prioritize. CMMC is very specific. And I think it's in that respect, I don't think it's necessarily the worst. I think its heart is, to quote a friend of mine recently, its heart is in the right place.
Well, I think that's the point. Getting very direct. A lot of NIST and ISO talks about, like you said, risk and analyzing risk and deciding on, and doesn't really tell you what to do. But 95% of this is, look, if you go through an ISO and it says you decide that the risk versus the reward of having a backup isn't required, then you can actually be ISO certified and not have a backup.
Right.
It's stupid, but the reality is that's what you can do. With things like CMMC, they're very defined. I like the CIS as well because it seems to be very defined.
Yep.
Ultimately, they're all getting to the same place, which is you should at least look at this. You should make a decision. If you're deciding I'm not going to lock my front door at night, then that's fine. Well, it's not fine, but it maybe if you live in the middle of nowhere and it's fine, but it's
CMMC does not allow you to assume a risk based on your risk tolerance. And that's the fundamental difference to me as somebody who's been a practitioner in things for a long time, is that it does not say establish risk. It doesn't care. It's like the honey badger.
Yeah, well, and that's it. Have this in place, or you're not compliant. I appreciate you taking the time with us today, Karen. We're obviously running out of time, so, and I appreciate everyone listening. This is pre-recorded, or not pre-recorded, this is recorded, so we will be publishing the recording afterwards if anyone missed it or if they need to share it with anybody. We put the link in for the PDF, so you can download the PDF from our site, and Karen put some links in as well. Thank you very much, and thank you, Karen, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your day. If you haven't already signed up for a trial of ThreatLocker, or you're not using it, just book a demo. I'm going to throw the link in the chat very quickly. If I can find my chat window now. Chat. I had the chat window and now there it is. To everyone. It's a 45-minute demo. We're going to show you all our auditing, our controls, and various different things and how they can be used in your environment, not just to help you get compliant, but also to stop ransomware, to stop malware, to get effective and real control over your security. And I've just dumped that in there. So if anyone wants to book a demo of ThreatLocker, just book a demo on there. If you're already using ThreatLocker and you want to figure out how you can get it into more of your clients, have a look at that as well. Thank you very much.